Hello, I'm Michele at the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Welcome back to part 3 of our read aloud of Nathaniel Fludd, Beastologist, Book 1, Flight of the Phoenix, written by R.L. LaFevers, illustrated by Kelly Murphy, published by Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt. Chapter 7. When Nate awoke, he found Greasel sitting on his chest, staring at him. Startled, he sat up suddenly, and she tumbled to the ground. "Oh, what'd you go and do that for?" she asked, rubbing her caboose. "Didn't mean to," Nate muttered. He swung his legs off the cot and rubbed the sand from his eyes. It was cooler than before, he noticed, and darker. He looked around for Aunt Phil. "She's out talking to those men," Greasel told him. "You got any food on you? 'Cause there was nothing in that pack of yours." Nate pointed to a platter on a table. She studied it for a moment, then snagged a small brown fruit and took a nibble. She made a face. "I shouldn't have left the plane." "But that was the agreement," Nate said. "You have to stay in the pack, actually," he said thoughtfully. "Aunt Phil said she'd deal with you once we landed." "No," Greasel squeaked. "I'll be good." And she clambered up Nate's leg to his knee and began plucking at his sleeve. "I'll stay in the pack, nice and quiet like." "What do you think she'd do to you?" he asked. Greasel shrugged. "Don't know. Never been caught before." "Well, just stay quiet in the pack and we'll see what happens. Sometimes grown-ups forget stuff they've said." The little gremlin nodded and scampered into the rucksack. Nate hauled it over his shoulder and went to find Aunt Phil. She was outside arguing with someone. They were standing in front of 2 camels piled high with supplies. As Nate approached, the man spoke rapidly, shook his head, and then stormed away. "Is something wrong?" Nate asked. "There you are. Had a good nap, did you?" Aunt Phil ignored his question. Yes. What did that man want?" She sighed. "He was supposed to come with us as a guide, but he backed out. It seems some Bedouin have been sighted in the area, and he doesn't want to risk it." "What are Bedouin?" "Nomads. They can be a bit territorial." It sounded to Nate as if the guide was being smart. Maybe he's right. Maybe it isn't worth the risk. "Nonsense. We'll be fine." "But what will we do for a guide?" "Why, I'll guide us, of course." Aunt Phil patted one of the large leather bags hanging from one of the camel's saddles. "I've got a Flood family map and my compass. We'll be fine. Now climb aboard," she said. "The sun is setting and it's cool enough to get started. We'll travel most of the night and sleep during the heat of the day." Aunt Phil cupped her hands for Nate to step into. He looked from her hands up to the saddle high on top of the camel. "We really have to ride those?" "Absolutely. These ships of the desert are much hardier for traveling under these conditions. They can go for 5 whole days without water in the heat of summer, 50 days in winter. Now do hurry, Nate. We've a long journey ahead of us and a schedule to keep." Nate bit back a sigh, clutched a leather strap hanging from the saddle, and placed his foot into Aunt Phil's hands. With a mighty heave, she sent him flying up. He grabbed hold of the saddle horn and scrambled into the saddle. Aunt Phil gave a firm nod, then went over to mount her camel from a stool. As Nate sat waiting, his camel turned his long neck around to stare at him. The camel had big, liquid brown eyes with long lashes. He was chewing something, his lips working up and down and all around. He did not look happy to have someone on his back. "Nice camel," Nate said, patting the creature's dusty, hairy neck. "Good camel." The camel gave one last chew, opened his lips, and spit a thick stream of camel saliva at Nate. Nate stared in disgust at the nasty glob plastered to his chest. There he is, getting spit at by the camel. "His name is Shabib," Aunt Phil said from atop her own camel. "You need to show him who's boss." And she grabbed her reins and slapped them against her camel's back. "Hut, hut, hut," she cried. Her camel launched into a fast trot. Nate grabbed his reins and slapped them like Aunt Phil had done. "Hut, hut, hut," he cried. Shabib turned back around to stare at him, his mobile lips working again. "Don't even think about it," Nate said. "Hut, hut, hut," he cried again, this time kicking his heels in against the camel's flanks. Still nothing. He glanced at Aunt Phil, who was far ahead now. Suddenly there was a loud thwack as one of the men gave Shabib a swat. The camel launched forward. Nate's teeth crashed together as he slapped down on the camel's back. From inside the pack, Greasel squealed, and if he hadn't been so busy trying to stay on top of the camel, Nate would have checked on her. As it was, all he could do was hang on tightly while excitement and nerves warred in his belly. This was, after all, his last chance to prove he was up to the task of being a Fludd. He had failed his parents. He couldn't risk failing Aunt Phil. Chapter 8. Nate struggled with Shabib as the village quickly disappeared from sight, and the last orange rays of the sun shimmered over the endless ocean of sand. It took him a while to learn to relax his body into the rhythm of the camel's stride. The stars had come out by the time Nate finally mastered it. With this small success under his belt, he grew a bit bold. Aunt Phil? Yes, Nate? You said you'd explain about my parents writing letters, he reminded her. Of course. She felt quiet a moment before asking, what do you know about Fludd family history? Nate shrugged. Not much, only that Floods have always been explorers and adventurers, and he was very much not an adventurer, he thought, but he didn't say that out loud. The first Fludd of record, a Sir Mungo Fludd, became obsessed with Marco Polo's account of his travels to the Orient, Aunt Phil began. He decided to retrace the journey for himself, only this time with surveyors and cartographers, so they could produce a map of the world. Nate recalled the map on the wall in his room. It had been signed by Sir Mungo Fludd. After many years of exploration, he returned and completed the map. He called it the Geographica, a map of the world. However, he knew that he'd seen only a small portion of what the world had to offer. So Sir Mungo had 8 sons, one for each cardinal and ordinal point on the compass. And when they were grown, he sent them off in 8 different directions, and they had orders to explore and survey the world, then report back to him so that they could update the Geographica. Picture of the Fludd family. Pictures. The Geographica, thus the age of exploration had begun. After many years, Sir Mungo's 7 sons returned, and he compiled the most complete map of all time. But what happened to the 8th Fludd? You said there were 8 brothers. Aunt Phil's face grew dark. We don't speak of him. Every family has its black sheep. He is ours. Nate wanted to ask more about him, but Aunt Phil started talking again. Of course, the Floods saw other things on their travels, new races of man, strange plants never seen before, all manners of fearsome beasts. Flavius Fludd, Sir Mungo's great-grandson, began studying these beasts and recorded all his knowledge in the Book of Beasts. For beastologists? But there weren't any beastologists yet, Nate. Her face grew troubled. Now that all sorts of explorers were traveling to these exotic places, they too had discovered the beasts. But being idiots, they hunted and captured the rare creatures until soon there were very few left. After we Floods discovered the disaster with the dodos, Honorius Fludd declared that from then on, one Fludd in every generation had to dedicate him or herself to protecting and caring for these beasts. That's when the science of beastology was born. Nate was quiet for a moment as he absorbed all this. Then he cleared his throat. But what does that have to do with my parents' letters? He asked in a very small voice. Aunt Phil laughed. Sorry, that was rather the long way about. My point was, for centuries, Floods have traveled, and for centuries we have recorded our travels in letters so as to report to those back home. Being an explorer is dangerous work, and we've always known that some of us won't return. Not wanting all our work to be lost, we write letters to record our findings. It's as much a part of being a Fludd as a love of exploration. That's why I'm so sure your parents wrote you letters. You're certain you didn't receive any? Nate thought hard, as far back as he could remember. Finally, he shook his head. No, only Miss Lumpton got letters, and only once a month. Aunt Phil said with a funny look in her eyes. She shook her head as if clearing it, and then changed the subject. Nate, would you fish my compass out of my saddlebag there? I want to be sure we're on the right course. Once the sun rose, it didn't take long for the day to heat up. Luckily, they reached the oasis shortly after dawn. There were a number of date palms and a small pool of water surrounded by rocks. Both camels completely ignored the commands to halt and marched straight over to the water. They lowered their heads and began drinking greedily. I suppose they've earned it, Aunt Phil said, and she reached down and patted her camel on the neck. Nate did the same, but Shabib stopped drinking and turned around to give him a baleful stare. Afraid the camel would spit at him again, Nate stopped patting. Suit yourself, he mumbled. His rucksack, looped over his saddle horn, began twitching as Greasel wriggled out. Are we back at the plane yet? Her small face fell as she looked around the oasis. What's this place, then? Shh, Nate hissed, looking around to see if Aunt Phil had heard. Luckily, her camel had finished drinking, so she had steered it away from the spring. Afraid of being left behind, Nate tugged on the reins, trying to get Shabib to follow. The camel wouldn't budge. Nate tried applying his heels to the camel's flanks. Still nothing. Come on, Nate said with one final tug at the reins. Like a shot, Shabib looped away from the water's edge and galloped after Aunt Phil. Greasel squeaked, and Nate tried to pull back on the reins. Then just as suddenly, Shabib stopped. Nate found himself airborne, tumbling end over tea kettle to land flat on his back in the sand. All the air whooshed out of his lungs. With a final squeal, Greasel landed a few paces to his left. Shabib snorted and shook his head and strolled over to Aunt Phil. Nate struggled to find his breath. I think I hate camels, he wheezed. I told you airplanes were better, said Greasel. Chapter 9. What, Aunt Phil asked, is that doing here? Nate raised his head from the sand and followed her gaze to Greasel. Oops. He corrected without thinking. Aunt Phil arched an eyebrow at him. Even so, that doesn't explain why she's here. Nate got to his feet. You said I didn't have to throw her overboard, he explained. Yes, but I didn't say she could come with us. I'm sorry, I thought you didn't want to leave her with the plane. I don't. Besides, Nate said, she's a beast and you're a beastologist. I would think that you would like to have her around. Aunt Phil sniffed. She's not a true beast. She's just a pest. Kind of like me, Nate thought. If he couldn't prove himself a true Fludd, he was just a pest dumped on Aunt Phil's doorstep. Aunt Phil stared at him for a long moment and then threw up her hands and shook her head. Very well. Keep her. Now let's quit talking and get these camels unloaded. As she turned and strode away, Nate risked a glance at Greasel. Phew, she said. That was close. Yes, it was, Nate said. Now be good and stay out of trouble. The gremlin suited. Aye, aye, Captain. Nate shook his head, then hurried to help Aunt Phil. Greasel proved to be quite a help in getting the tent set up. Her tiny fingers were especially good at untangling knots. But when Nate pointed that out to Aunt Phil, she merely grunted and shoved a bundle of fragrant sticks at him. Put those in the tent, he sneezed, then did as he instructed. When the camp was finally set up to Aunt Phil's liking, they settled down to dinner in the tent. Aunt Phil handed Nate a piece of dried goat meat that tasted like salty leather. He tried to hand it back to her. She shook her head. Eat it. You'll need to keep up your strength out here. He choked it down as fast as he could and then popped a date into his mouth. It was sticky and sweet, almost like a piece of toffee. When Aunt Phil wasn't looking, Nate slipped Greasel 2 dates and then shooed her away to hide behind his rucksack. He wasn't sure how Aunt Phil would feel about sharing food with the gremlin. Almost as if reading his mind, Aunt Phil looked up. Where is that pest of yours? She asked, glancing around the tent. Oh, she's already asleep in my rucksack, Nate said. Wanting desperately to change the subject, he asked, what exactly are we going to do with the phoenix? Well, let's check, shall we? And Aunt Phil turned to one of her saddlebags. She pulled from it a very large, very old-looking book and held it up for Nate to see. The Book of Beasts, she announced. The only copy in existence and so sacred to us Floods that I would protect the book with my life. Nate hoped it wouldn't come to that. Do you have a copy of the Geographica too? No. Aunt Phil's face grew sad. Your father had the only surviving copy of that book. I'm afraid it was lost at sea with him. They were both silent for a moment, and then Aunt Phil began to read from the book. As the sun sets on the phoenix's 500th birthday, it returns to its place of birth and builds a funeral pyre. Amid the rays of the setting sun, it sets itself on fire, burning until it is reduced to a pile of ash. The secret to a phoenix hatching is to be sure the pile of ash never grows cold. How do we do that? Nate asked. Aunt Phil continued reading. The nest must be protected from the wind. It is also wise to feed additional fuel to the glowing ash, especially during the cold desert nights. Aunt Phil stopped reading and looked at Nate. Is that it? That's it. Well, he said with a smile, that doesn't sound too hard. Of course not, Aunt Phil agreed. I told you there was nothing to worry about. Good night, Nate. Aunt Phil snuggled down and was asleep within moments. But when Nate lay down, his mind kept churning through the events of the past 3 days. Plus, it was too light to go to sleep, which gave Nate an idea. Moving quietly so as not to wake Aunt Phil, he pulled his rucksack closer. He reached inside and got out his sketchbook. Glancing over his shoulder, he angled the paper away from Aunt Phil and began to draw. As his pencil flew across the page, his mind began to sort through all that had happened. He decided he liked Aunt Phil. Except for her unreasonable dislike of gremlins, she was very nice. Even better, she told him stuff, important stuff that no other grown-up had ever taken the time to tell him before. She also didn't leave him behind, no matter how lacking he was in Fludd's skills. What you doing? Nate jerked in surprise at Greasel's voice next to his ear. Drawing, he whispered, closing the book. I want to see, Greasel said. Shh, you'll wake Aunt Phil. Greasel tugged on the book. But I want to see, she whined. Oh, all right. Nate opened to the page on which he'd been drawing. Greasel pointed to the picture he had drawn of her. What's that? You, he said. She tilted her head and studied the page. Is that what I look like? He glanced down at the drawing. Yep. Pretty, aren't I? Nate looked at her big round eyes, her bat-like ears, and her sharp little teeth. Quite pretty, he said, trying not to smile. And here she is. And what's that? She asked, pointing to the facing page. A map, Nate whispered, closing the book. He didn't want Aunt Phil to know he'd tried his hand at map making. He wasn't very good at it. It's not as pretty as the picture of me, Greasel pointed out. No, it's not, Nate agreed, and he put the sketchbook aside. Now let's get some sleep. Nate was awakened by the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The notes were pure and lovely, but haunting as well, as if sadness might be just around the corner. He pushed to his knees. Greasel was already at the tent opening. Peeking out, he joined her. What is that? She wiped an oily tear from her eye. Don't know. Nate stepped outside and saw Aunt Phil standing nearby. The music grew louder and she pointed to the horizon. Nate could make out a bright shape against the darkening sky. The phoenix, he whispered. The phoenix, Aunt Phil agreed. Shh, now we don't want to startle it. Nate stood transfixed as the brilliant red and gold bird approached. The phoenix swooped into the oasis area, its tail feathers streaming behind like an orange comet. Sweet, soaring music filled the air as the phoenix circled overhead once before landing on a palm tree. Here it is. As the last of the setting sun's golden rays spread across the desert, the phoenix gave a final burst of song, then erupted into flames. Nate gasped in surprise. Greasel squeaked and dived under the nearest bedroll. Nate watched the pillar of fire in stunned silence. He hadn't truly believed Aunt Phil, not really, not until this minute, but there really were magical beasts in this world, and he really would get to help take care of one. This was turning out much better than he had imagined. As they continued to watch, the flames crackled yellow, then orange, and then red, and there was a flash of green flames just before the fire died out. Now that the fire was silent, Nate heard a noise, a low rumbling sound, almost like thunder. He looked up to the ridge above the oasis and fear punched him in the belly. Outlined against the dusky sky, a score of men riding camels galloped toward them, their curved swords drawn. Afraid, Nate quickly slipped back into the tent and hoped they hadn't seen him. Chapter 10. The Bedouin, Nate heard Aunt Phil whisper. Peeking out through the tent flap, he watched them approach. The leader halted his camel and dismounted, then strode toward Aunt Phil. He studied her suspiciously. Are you a Turk? No, Aunt Phil replied, I am a Fludd. Perhaps you've heard of us? The leader shook his head. No Floods here. You are trespassing and must leave. You speak English, Aunt Phil sounded surprised. We fought with British soldiers against the Turks in the Great War many years ago. Ah, I see. Well, there is no war now, and I am just a scientific observer, she said. You are still trespassing, the leader repeated. This oasis belongs to us. Anger flashed in his eyes. You must leave. Aunt Phil shook her head. I'm very sorry, but I can't leave until I've done what I came for. Are you refusing? He sounded as if he couldn't quite believe it. Nate couldn't either. Yes, I really must insist that I stay, but it will be only for a short while. Instead of answering, the Bedouin leader shouted out instructions to his men. They began to descend upon Aunt Phil. She took one look at the advancing men, then turned back to their leader. Very well, then, I ask that you grant me hospitality. A murmur of surprise rose up from the group. The leader narrowed his eyes and gave Aunt Phil an assessing look. You know of Bedouin hospitality? Aunt Phil nodded. And here's a picture of them. I know if anyone, friend or enemy, asks for Bedouin hospitality, you are honor bound to grant them food, water, and shelter for 3 days. The Bedouin leader did not look happy that she knew this. He looked around the oasis. You were alone? Aunt Phil hesitated but a second before nodding. Yes, I am alone. Very well, our code of honor demands we grant you hospitality, but only for 3 days, and after that you will experience Bedouin justice for your crime of trespassing. His voice was harsh, and Nate wondered what exactly Bedouin justice would be. They waited while Aunt Phil mounted her camel, and then they led her camel and Shabib from the oasis. At the ridge, Aunt Phil paused and looked back over her shoulder. Nate stood just inside the tent, watching helplessly as the only person who cared anything about him was taken away. And we're going to stop there for now. This was part 3 of Nathaniel Fludd, Beastologist, Book 1, Flight of the Phoenix, written by R.L. LaFevers, illustrated by Kelly Murphy, and published by Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt. I'm Michele at the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Join me next time for part 4. Bye.